Welcome to Forbidden Files. Japanese engineers estimated it would take 5 years to build. Using prisoners of war and forced laborers, they did it in 15 months. 415 kilometers of railway track, through some of the densest, most disease-ridden jungle on Earth. And by the time the last spike was driven, one man had died for approximately every 3 meters of track laid. This is the Death Railway, and the story of how it was built is one of the most brutal chapters of the Second World War. February 15, 1942. Singapore falls to Japan in the largest surrender of British-led forces in history. 80,000 soldiers, British, Australian, Indian, Dutch, become prisoners of war overnight. Among them, 30,000 British soldiers, 13,000 Australians, 18,000 Dutch, 700 Americans. They expected to be held in camps until the war ended. They had no idea what was coming. By mid-1942, Japan had a serious problem. Japanese forces in Burma were fighting to push into India, but their supply lines ran by sea through waters increasingly dominated by Allied naval power. After the Battle of Midway in June 1942, a decisive American victory, those sea routes became even more dangerous. Japan needed an overland supply route, and they needed it fast. They looked at the map. A railway from Thailand through the jungle to Burma would solve everything. British engineers had surveyed the same route decades earlier and concluded it was impossible. The terrain too steep, the jungle too dense, the cost too high. Japan had a solution the British had not considered. They would not pay their workers. They would not need to. The workforce came from two sources. Over 60,000 Allied prisoners of war, transported from Singapore and the Dutch East Indies to work camps along the proposed railway route, and approximately 200,000 Asian laborers, known as Romusha, conscripted from Malaya, Burma, Java, and other occupied territories. Many of the Romusha were recruited with promises of good pay and conditions. They arrived to find jungle, disease, and Japanese guards with rifles. Most would never go home. The camps stretched for hundreds of miles through some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. Dense malarial jungle. Monsoon rains that turned the ground into mud so deep it swallowed a man's leg. Temperatures reaching 40 degrees Celsius, and almost no medicine. Prisoners arriving at their camps found bamboo huts with no floors, no proper latrines, and food rations calculated to keep a man alive just long enough to work, not to keep him healthy. A thin gruel of rice and whatever could be scavenged from the jungle. That was all. The work was crushing. Clearing primary jungle with hand tools. Blasting through solid rock with drills held by one man while another hit them with a hammer. Carrying railway sleepers, each one weighing over 100 kilograms, through mud and heat. Building bridges over fast-moving rivers using timber cut from the jungle. 600 bridges in total, all of it by hand. No heavy machinery, no cranes, just human bodies and basic tools. Up to 18 hours a day. In early 1943, the pace intensified. Japanese commanders were behind schedule and began what prisoners called the Speedo period, a frantic acceleration that pushed men beyond any reasonable limit of human endurance. Sick men were dragged from hospital huts and forced to work. Men with cholera were put on half rations if they could not meet their quota. Prisoners with tropical ulcers so deep they exposed the bone were beaten for working too slowly. One Australian soldier described watching men work until they simply fell over and stay where they fell. The Japanese and Korean guards who ran the camps were not all sadistic, but enough of them were that every day brought the possibility of random, unprovoked violence for any perceived failure to work hard enough. The most notorious section of the entire railway was a cutting through solid rock in the Tenasserim Hills, a stretch 500 meters long and up to 25 meters deep that prisoners called Hellfire Pass. The name came from the night shifts, when prisoners worked by torchlight, drilling and hammering through rock in the darkness, the flames of the torches casting shifting shadows across the stone walls. Work on Hellfire Pass began in April 1943 with approximately 1,000 POWs. By August 1943, when it was finished, only 100 of those men were still alive. The other 900 had died in 4 months. At one cutting, Captain Reg Newton later reported that 68 men were beaten to death during the construction of Hellfire Pass alone. Then the monsoon came. From May 1943, torrential rain fell for months. Work sites became lakes of mud. Standing water collected everywhere, and in that water, cholera. Cholera spreads through contaminated water and kills within hours. Symptoms begin with violent diarrhea and vomiting. Within 24 hours, a man can lose so much fluid he is in shock. Without intravenous rehydration, which the camps did not have, death comes quickly. Cholera swept through camp after camp along the railway route. Prisoners watched men who had been working beside them in the morning, dead by nightfall. In the middle of this, the POW medical officers performed something close to miracles. Without drugs, without equipment, without proper facilities, they improvised. Australian surgeon Sir Ernest Weary Dunlop became one of the most celebrated figures in Australian history for his work in the camps. He performed operations by torchlight. He extracted bullets with improvised tools. He kept men alive through sheer determination and ingenuity when the Japanese refused to provide medical supplies. Some men survived the death railway specifically because of what he and doctors like him did with almost nothing. Some men survived the death railway specifically because of what he and doctors like him did with almost nothing. On October 17, 1943, the two construction teams, one building north from Thailand, one building south from Burma, met at Three Pagodas Pass on the border. The railway was complete, 415 kilometers of track, built in 15 months. Where British engineers had estimated 5 years, the Japanese celebrated. The surviving workers simply stopped. Where WS got taken, the cost in human lives was staggering. More than 12,000 Allied prisoners of war died during construction. Among them, 6,900 British soldiers, 2,800 Australians, 2,700 Dutch, and 133 Americans. But these numbers, appalling as they are, do not capture the full scale of the death. Of the 200,000 Asian Romusha laborers, estimates suggest between 75,000 and 90,000 died. The records of the Romusha were almost entirely destroyed or never kept. These were men, women, and in some cases children, conscripted from occupied countries, worked to death and forgotten. No official memorial, no national commemoration. The exact number of their dead will never be known. And then the railway that had cost so many lives proved almost useless. Allied aircraft began bombing the railway almost as soon as it was completed. The bridge over the River Kwai, made famous by the 1957 film, was bombed repeatedly by the RAF and USAAF from 1944. Supply deliveries along the line never reached the levels Japanese planners had projected. The railway operated for less than 2 years before Japan surrendered in August 1945. The strategic objective it was built to achieve, supplying an invasion of India, was never accomplished. The railway that killed nearly 100,000 people achieved almost nothing. After Japan's surrender, war crimes trials were held in Singapore in 1946 and 1947. 111 individuals who had worked on the Burma Railway were convicted of war crimes. 32 were sentenced to death and executed. Among them was Sergeant Seiichi Okada, a medical orderly who had become known as Dr. Death for his systematic torture of sick prisoners. Many others were never tried. The records were incomplete. Witnesses had died, and the Romusha laborers, whose suffering had been even greater than the Allied POWs, had no government to advocate for them at the trials. The men who survived came home changed, malnourished to skeletons, carrying diseases they would battle for the rest of their lives. Haunted by what they had witnessed and endured, many struggled to speak about it for decades. The psychological damage of the death railway followed survivors for the rest of their lives, in nightmares, in sudden rages, in an inability to explain to people who had not been there what it had actually been like. Some never spoke of it at all. Some never spoke of it at all. Today, Hellfire Pass is a memorial museum maintained by the Australian government. Visitors can walk through the cutting, the same rock walls that prisoners chipped through by torchlight in the monsoon of 1943. The marks left by the hand drills are still visible in the stone. The Kanchanaburi War Cemetery in Thailand holds the graves of 6,982 Allied prisoners, row after row of identical white headstones, many of them marked simply, "Known unto God," because nobody survived who could identify the man buried there. A railway built in 15 months through impossible terrain, almost 100,000 people dead, a strategic objective that was never achieved, and tens of thousands of Asian laborers whose deaths were so poorly recorded that we still do not know exactly how many there were. The Death Railway is remembered through the films and the memorials and the white headstones. But most of the people who died building it have no headstones at all. But are dozens of stories like this one that most people never hear. Subscribe and we'll keep finding them. The next file is already open.